that is wishful thinking at the moment, but we're going to try and ride that wishful thinking at the moment. And for a moment, just pretend that our World Cup is not at threat right now. And we'll do a little bit, not necessarily a preview to next year now that we are less than a year away from the Women's World Cup in Brazil in 2027, but just kind of look at the state of the favorites right now. We will not start with the champions, but we're going to start, of course, Jeff, with the U.S. Women's National Team. As you mentioned, they are always in and amongst the favorites, if not the favorite, going into any World Cup. However, this time, maybe that sway of power has changed so much based on the likes of England and Spain, as always. But looking at the U.S. Women's National Team now, less than a year out of the World Cup, how would you say development has been going under Emma Hayes?
As well as possible. I mean, I think this is a team, when you look at their worst World Cup ever, you and I were there, you know, and the day-to-day of it, and the vibes were not good. The results were not good, obviously, at a historic low in 2023. This is a team that has been rebuilt, obviously a new head coach, but really from the ground up. I mean, a young core group, entirely new players, and then even behind the scenes where the casual fan wouldn't see, that next crop of 25 or so players developing with the U23s. There's been more programming for that, which is essentially the B team for the US, or the futures team, that has had more programming than ever, really, certainly in the past decade, as they've developed that team. So they're developing for now and beyond, so that I think 2023 was a culmination of things that happened far before that. Obviously, there were other factors, but you know, there was a lot building into that moment. And Emma Hayes has come in with the idea that we need to be better and win the 2027 World Cup, but we also can't forget about what's coming in 2031. And I think she's done as good as she possibly can with that. The players have stepped up. You look at the results in Brazil. I mean, I said it before they went there and lost, that they maybe needed to go do that. I think we maybe couldn't have imagined how much they got beat up and punched back as well in sort of a bloodbath of certainly a second game. But that group has never experienced that. And this particular group exactly has never experienced Spain in the way that they will in October in these friendlies, which I think will tell us a lot about how they match up in a completely different way against a team that's going to control the ball and control the game. So, yeah, I think you look at what the U.S. has done against Japan in the spring, what they did in Brazil, which was what they really needed to go experience that away. They don't get a lot of away games at all. And then they're going to have Spain coming through. Those three tests on top of what they've been doing, I think puts them in a position that, to your point, Alexis, it's no longer the days, and it hasn't been. We saw that in 2023 where they are one of two or three favorites and they're automatically in the semifinals. This is a team that is capable of winning the World Cup. It's a team that could go out in a quarterfinal based on a bad day or a bad draw in the tournament, because that's the state of the game, that there are more teams that can win one-off games, and there are more teams that can win a World Cup, as we saw Spain winning for the first time, the culmination of a decade worth of work at the youth level into the senior level.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting one, too, because I do remember last World Cup, of course, when the USA bowed out, and I interviewed Megan Rapinoe through tears. She almost started laughing, where she was saying, if we look at the positive side, though, it's not that we suck. She was like, it's the fact that the rest of the world is getting the investment they need and they're catching up. And ultimately, that's what we all wanted for the game. And a lot has happened in 4 years. A lot more countries have thrown their hats in the ring, maybe not necessarily as favorites, but also contenders. So Emily, from the outside as well, looking in at the US, are they still viewed as the powerhouses as they once were, or who else is in the mix for you?
I think definitely, like, their years of history, you don't eradicate that overnight. Like, they have a very advanced team, and you look at sort of the other teams that have come up more recently. We're talking, 4 years of development, but the US national team has had so much development from that's not going to go away overnight. And they've only seemed to have gotten stronger, like what Jeff was saying, under Emma Hayes. Obviously, I knew Emma at Chelsea, and I know what type of manager she is. I know how the level she demands from her players. I'm not surprised that the US national women's team are going back that way and are getting back in that conversation. I don't know if they ever really left the favourites conversation, but definitely, obviously, the last World Cup wasn't how they wanted to end it. But as you say, there are other teams that are building their way back up. I think we've seen that over the past few years, that anyone can sort of come into these competitions. If you have a good tournament, it's anyone's game. And I think that's what really sets teams apart, is your ability to sort of absorb the pressure and sort of play the occasion as much as you're playing these games. Because for a team that has maybe never been in a World Cup or has only ever gotten through to the but hasn't gone past the group stage, to be in a World Cup quarterfinal or World Cup semi-final. It's a completely different feeling. And I think what some of these teams that have sort of consistently been in that conversation have done well is learn how to play these games. And that only comes with experience. So some of those teams that I think had a really good 2023 World Cup, we're talking Colombia, Australia, that sort of started to develop their sense of how this all works and sort of pushing through into those tournaments. I think they'll be ones to watch this year. I think obviously Brazil as hosts, they're going to be in that conversation, but I think it's a really interesting time to be a fan of women's football, because it's really difficult to look at, especially the crop that have qualified, are the ones you expect to qualify. We were doing our year out predictions, and even then I'm looking at the qualifiers going, you don't know which of these sort of teams are going to be able to break through and what anyone can do on these stages. So it's super exciting. And I think having a World Cup in Brazil as well is such an interesting thing for sort of the South American teams and those advantages and everything that comes into play. It's such an interesting time, I think, to be talking about the World Cup, because it's so exciting with all the teams that could possibly be coming up as contenders.
Yeah, and let's continue talking about contenders, especially about the host country, shall we? Because when we look at Brazil last time around, of course, bowing out in the group stages, that was a shock. We're all left with that image of Marta crying and making such a passionate plea and thank you for World Cup, especially in Brazil, to continue, for football to continue being invested in women's football as well, even though I was a bit happy because that meant Jamaica got out of the group, something I did not expect. But still, looking at Brazil, we know exactly what the game means in that country, Jeff. So how much of a chance do they have to be viewed as contenders, especially with the developments we have seen them make post-Marta?
Yeah, they're absolutely contenders. I think they have been. I mean, look, they've been underachievers, frankly, certainly in the last World Cup, but in prior editions as well. They've had some hard luck potentially in some editions. I mean, certainly this US-Brazil rivalry, the 2011 World Cup, right, and the drama of that game. But, I think I look at those US games in Brazil and the difficulty that the US had. And Emma Hayes talked about this as well, like how many other favorites have gone down to Brazil to experience that and will experience it for the first time next year. And it is quite different. I mean, yes, there are great crowds in Europe, even in the US, but they're very different. A sold out US stadium, with full respect as a fellow American, is nothing like what we've seen from Brazil, and the deafening noise, the heckling, the really pro-partisan Brazil crowd. And I think that they can ride that. I think there is a danger that they'll have to figure out, that we saw in the U.S. friendlies, that does the emotion get the better of them in it? Because you look at how much of an advantage that can be. And certainly in that second game in Fortaleza, I think things got out of hand in both ways, but really tipped the scale out of hand for Brazil. So this is a team that has really developed depth under Arthur Elias. Again, from a leading perspective, some of the antics on the sideline, that's part of, to a degree, his shtick. That's how he rallies the troops. I mean, I think it's part of the DNA in some ways to be fighting and to fight back, especially against the Americans, quite frankly. But you have to figure out how to bottle that and put it into a positive way. So I think that's a piece that they'll have to figure out as a home nation, potentially with the emotions, even, I mean, heightened emotions as it is, but maybe potentially as Marta's last ride, winning it finally on home soil. I mean, there's so much there emotionally. But speaking actually tactically into the team's depth, their depth has been unreal. I mean, over the past 4 years, really have developed beyond just the days of, well, we have Formiga, we have Marta, we have Cristiani. They have developed a team, much like the U.S., I would say, like other contenders, that is, a starting 11, 2 starting 11s deep, that they can really play against these contenders, these fellow world powers. So I think this is a team, again, that very much can win the World Cup, will have the advantage on home soil, but we'll have the pressure, and we'll see, whether they can get past some of these disappointments. You mentioned that group stage. I mean, there have been too many disappointments for the talent that they have. They have the talent, they have the depth, and this is a team that absolutely could be standing on the podium at the end of the day.
Yeah, I suppose final one on the Women's World Cup and Brazil, Emily, before we move on to the summer transfer window so far. But with everything Jeff said and everything we saw from Brazil against the U.S. women's national team recently, you just feel like the stage is set there for them on home soil to make a very deep run.
Yeah, definitely. I think I look back to when Brazil played England at Wembley in a friendly, and that was such an interesting game. It was such an end-to-end game. And I think like what Jeff was saying, they're a really, really good team. And I think they've developed a lot of composure. Like Jeff said, sometimes the emotions do get to them, but I think that's natural of any team. And I think that is something that Arthur Elias will be looking at sort of building out of them, because he's really developed that team into a really well coached. They understand their playing style. They know what they're trying to do. They've got their tactics pretty well right against England. And I think when you're looking at these games, they've now got, and I guess it's a benefit compared to several other teams, that they now have a year basically just to prepare for the World Cup. Whereas, England have to still qualify. The US needs to qualify. All of these teams still need to go through some prep stages to be getting through to the World Cup, whereas they've got a year now just to sort of prepare and go for it. So I think it's a really interesting time now for them to see what can they do in this short space of time, how can they develop, where are they going to develop. And I think they are basically primed for having a really, really good World Cup. And I think I've seen it from the Euros in 2022, having a competition on home soil, it does change things. It does make those emotions higher, but it also is something that is incredible to feel, and just even be in the stadiums and the atmosphere. It's something that all of those Brazil players are going to want to feel and are going to be feeling when they're playing. And I think the big question is also, what is Marta going to do? She obviously had a retirement. She came out of retirement. She then sort of had another soft retirement. So I don't particularly see a World Cup in Brazil without a Marta, but it'll be interesting to see, the conversations in and around that team of, is she going to play? Is she not going to play? What are the contingencies for her not playing? What's the plan if she does play? And I think that's such an exciting thing as well, to be in and around that Brazil team of, is the great of the game going to be there or not? And could you be the next person to step up and have that moment? Or are you going to play around her and have a World Cup with her? So it's such an exciting time, I think, for Brazil. And I'm really excited for them to have that on home soil, because it is such an exciting moment. I think having a World Cup on home soil and any sort of major tournament it really brings everyone together, and hopefully the country gets behind Brazil and brings the atmosphere like you're talking about, because I think it will be an exceptional World Cup.